Hello, and welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar. I'm your host, Robert Doar, and thanks for tuning in today. As president of the American Enterprise Institute, I have the unique privilege of working with America's greatest policy experts. These scholars focus on policy issues in the fields of education, economics, energy, foreign and defense, and so much more. Subscribe to this podcast for exclusive access to in-depth discussions on the most pressing policy issues. Together, with my guests, we'll challenge political preconceptions, explore innovative ideas, and create, I hope, a freer and safer world. And joining me today is Kori, who leads our Foreign and Defense Research Center in an outstanding fashion. Has now for 4 years, I think, Kori. Is that right?
That is exactly right.
Every day's been a joy here at AEI. And I wanted to kind of go around the world here. But as our basis for conversation, I do recommend to our listeners an article you wrote in Foreign Affairs earlier this year called The Case for Conservative Internationalism, How to Reverse the Inward Turn of Republican Foreign Policy. It's appeared in Foreign Affairs, the distinguished journal. And it's really outstanding, and our listeners should look it up and read it in whole. But we're going to cover certain parts of it during this conversation along with some other things. And my first question to you, Kori, is you make the case, or you say in the article, that Americans are reluctant internationalists. What does that mean?
It means that it's always difficult to persuade Americans to care about what's happening outside of our borders because we won the geopolitical lottery. We have great neighbors in Canada and Mexico, and we are bounded on the other two sides by oceans. And so almost every war you can imagine the United States fighting is a war of choice. And what typically encourages Americans to care about the rest of the world, we tend to be slow as threats gather because we will be the last ones affected. But what typically propels Americans to care about the rest of the world is values. Is defending human dignity, expanding economic opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place.
Now, you make the case in the article that it's not just values that are at stake in some of these international conflicts that we're facing in the world. It's also our prosperity. Give us a little of that. What if I said to you, well, values, schmalues, all I care about is my income and my prosperity and what's happening here in the United States. Mm-hmm. How is America's prosperity at risk with some of the conflicts around the world?
Security is a precondition for predictability, and predictability is necessary for the fulgency of economic activity. If you think the rule of law internationally doesn't matter, then you should be very hesitant to open a business in China or Russia where the rule of law actually doesn't matter, right? So we take for granted the rule of law, that individuals have rights and recourse against government and against predation of all sorts of kinds. If that isn't the case, then people don't invest money, people don't open businesses, people don't contract for services, because those become unreliable and unpredictable transactions. And so if you think, for example, the U.S. shouldn't care about Ukraine, that means you think the U.S. shouldn't care about food shortages in the developing world because the price of grain internationally and the availability of grain internationally fundamentally depends on exports from Ukraine. If you think the United States shouldn't care about Russian aggression, then you think the United States shouldn't care whether European businesses are still profitable enough to invest in American companies. And it means you don't care about exports from those economies that are essential to supply chains in the United States, especially if you're worried about the reliability of supply chains that run through China.
So a lot of our prosperity is dependent on a relatively free and open trade around the world. And it's not just consumers of lower-cost products. It's also exporters of important commodities, like especially in the agriculture business. So the American people do need to understand the relevancy to their prosperity of a stable world or a free world.
Absolutely. And they do. The friction we are seeing in American foreign policy right now is that the overwhelming majority of Americans, for example, even 69% of Republicans, believe the United States should be supporting Ukraine as they defend their liberty. That's not translating into political support, in particular in the House of Representatives right now.
So let's talk about Ukraine a little bit. You have a line in the paper, in the article, referring to the post 9/11 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, and you say the costs of Afghanistan and Iraq were so much greater than the public was led to believe. And your point is that excessive cost, more than we expected or were led to believe, left a bad taste in the mouths of Americans about foreign intervention and foreign involvement. I've seen it with certain senators in the United States Senate say, I was involved in those wars, and I think I don't want to get more involved in something in Europe involving Ukraine. But Ukraine is different.
Ukraine is different. Let me take the first part of your question first, though, which is that the mistakes of the decision to invade Iraq and the way the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan were managed are going to cast a long shadow over Americans' willingness to undertake big international actions. What Jim Mattis and I learned when we were doing the surveys of public attitudes for our book, Warriors and Citizens, is that the American public is colossally ignorant about defense issues. Most people can't come within a factor of 6 of the size of the Marine Corps. But the beautiful thing is that Americans' judgment on these issues, which is different from knowledge, their judgment is actually terrific. They hold the President of the United States accountable for failed wars because they understand intrinsically that it's the President who decides the strategy and the resourcing for American wars. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is Ukraine different? Yes, Ukraine is different. Since 1945, the United States has constructed and sustained an international order that believes in self-determination of peoples and that borders should only change by mutual consent. Russia has trampled both of those principles flat in their invasion of Ukraine. They are attempting to destroy Ukrainian existence as separate from Russia.
Can I just stop you for 1 minute? You said the United States has constructed and sustained the way it was in the world. But wouldn't it be better to say the United States and its allies has constructed and sustained? Sometimes when
Absolutely.
I think... Okay, so you agree. Because I find that to some Americans, the sound of "we did it" reminds them of a kind of American arrogance that they are worried about. And when we say that this is something we together with Great Britain and France and Germany and Japan have constructed, that's benefited all of us, not just us, it's benefited them too. And we can't let it all fall apart because Russia invades Ukraine.
You are exactly right. And I would underscore your very good point by saying that we are often frustrated that America's allies don't do more. And that's true. American allies should be doing more. We overlook the fact that no dominant power in the international order in history has had as much voluntary assistance from other countries as the United States has since 1945. And the reason is because we designed an order that isn't just beneficial to us, it's beneficial to everyone, because it's about stable and secure borders, self-determination for peoples, free trade that makes all of us more prosperous, and security guarantees from the United States that help share the burden of mutual defense.
Okay, so I want to turn to a slightly different topic because it's been on my mind lately, and that is just how do you see what is your view of the importance climate issues should play in international negotiations?
So I am not an expert on climate issues. So I guess my first answer is I would ask somebody who knows more than I do the answer to that question. But what I can say is that I do think the Biden administration hasn't made clear where priorities lie in their foreign policy agenda. And I noticed this in flagging support for Ukraine. Because when the president says, we'll do whatever it takes for as long as it takes, my mom justifiably says, really, as much as it takes and open-endedly? Because what the president hasn't said is, where does this fit in how we think about climate, how we think about China? He hasn't prioritized and helped my mom to understand where this fits. And I think that's a problem with climate, too.
Well, the reason I bring it up is sometimes I get the feeling from some people around the Biden administration, especially former Senator Kori, that the climate's so important and China's involvement in climate, in reductions in carbon, global warming gases is so important. Well, if you do really good on this, maybe we won't worry so much about Taiwan or Hong Kong. Do you ever worry about that? Do you ever worry that the priority for some of these people that are very concerned about the climate is altering the way they view other important issues in foreign affairs?
Absolutely. First of all, they're not making clear that that's what they're doing. So Americans can't make a judgment about whether we should support those kinds of trade-offs. But second of all, it's sort of a reprise of the Iranian nuclear agreement that the Obama administration negotiated, which is it was important to try and get limitations on Iran's nuclear developments, but they traded absolutely everything else in order to get that. They traded concern about Iran destabilizing regional governments, about terrorism, about human rights abuses, about freedom of passage in the Straits of Hormuz. I do worry that the Biden administration, because they are not being clear about where does climate fit in everything else that we are trying to do with China, that they will make that kind of mistake as the Obama administration did with Iran.
So we're having this conversation at a time when President Biden is apparently putting pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to slow down or ease up on the invasion of Gaza by the Israeli military in response to the horrible actions of Hamas on October 7th. All our listeners know this story. They know the situation. And I want to ask you kind of a tough question about that, because I was in Germany recently, and I went to Nuremberg, and there's a castle in Nuremberg. You can get up at the top of the castle, and you can look over the whole city. And there's an exhibit that they put on the windows of the castle that where you're looking over the city, where you can see pictures from that vantage point of Nuremberg in 1939. And then you can see pictures in 1945. And then, of course, you're looking at the present. And so 39, bustling German city, pre-war. 1945, leveled city. And then we look at the present. Not so long ago, David Remnick of The New Yorker wrote an article about what was going on in Israel, and he went and talked to some Israelis, and they said that they looked at Gaza the way Americans looked at Germany in World War II. How do you react to that?
Given the terrorist attack that Hamas propagated on October 7th, which was the deadliest day for Jews since Nuremberg fell, I'm sympathetic to that Israeli perspective. The other thing I would say is that since 1945, we have grown increasingly precious that war can be antiseptic, that you can achieve political capitulation of an enemy at whatever small price you are willing to pay and leave their cities pristine and leave their electrical grids up and kill nobody except combatants. And that's not how this works. Nobody is good at urban warfare. The American military is not good. You see what the Russians are doing as they attempt to take Ukrainian cities. The Israelis have a largely reserve army, which means they're not spending every day thinking about how do we do urban warfare well. And that's even before you get to the fact that Hamas is putting rockets on apartment buildings. They are tunneling under hospitals. They have taken hostages. They're using their own population as human shields. So this isn't just messy because of the Israelis taking the fight to Gaza. It's messy by design from Hamas. And we shouldn't lose perspective on that.
I also wonder whether there are some situations where, and this is going to sound awfully strong, where a people have to take responsibility for the actions of their military or what appears to be their leaders. Hamas was running Gaza. And you can't just say, well, it's not me, it's them. So, yeah, it's a heartbreaking, terrible situation.
William Tecumseh Sherman is expansive on this. He writes a letter to the mayor of Atlanta just before he conquered the city. And the mayor of Atlanta was arguing, please don't destroy personal property, just fight the military. And Sherman says, it is those civilians who are keeping that military in the field, and they will not capitulate until they feel the hard hand of war.
Okay, so that's a little history. Speaking of history, one of the things that I think we're concerned about in the United States right now is an absence, and I think you've written this, an absence of presidential leadership to sort of make the case for supporting Ukraine to the American people, make the case for protecting Taiwan, make the case for a strong national defense given the complexities of the world. And I guess the first question is, what's your take on the President Biden's ability to make the case for these various endeavors?
I would say he's done a terrible job, except that he hasn't done the job at all for the most part, right? That what Jim and I found in the surveys we did of American public attitudes for warriors and citizens is that the major factor in persuading Americans to care about the rest of the world is American political leaders, and particularly the president, clearly and consistently over time making the case for it. And President Biden has not done that for aid to Ukraine. He hasn't explained where this fits in priorities, why it matters so desperately, why it's worth so much American money and weaponry that we need ourselves to do. And I think, to be honest, I think the White House doesn't consider him very good at it and is increasingly concerned about how frail and elderly he looks. And so they are trying to have others make the case, but there's no substitute for presidential leadership.
Speaking of presidential leadership, and you've written about this and you've studied this, you're an historian as much as you are a foreign and defense policy expert, maybe more so. And your article was about the case for conservative internationalism, and it talked a lot about Republican Party and Republican Party's struggle resolving these foreign policy challenges. So in the post-war period, we have Ike, we have Nixon, we have Reagan, and Reagan Bush, the first Bush, we have George W. Bush, and we have Donald Trump. Looking at those collection of presidents, who's your favorite? Who do you think made the case for the proper kind of reluctant internationalism that you advocate for in this article?
I'm an Eisenhower Republican, which shouldn't surprise you. I wrote my PhD dissertation on strategy in the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations. I think Eisenhower understood how important it is for the United States not simply to be a dominant military power, but Eisenhower really believed the role of the American military was to hold security stable while the ingenuity and economic dynamism of the United States won the Cold War. He genuinely believed, to an even greater extent than Reagan, that the attractiveness of the American way of life is our superpower, and that capitalizing on that, on encouraging others to want it, helping others to get it, is the most cost-effective way to keep the United States safe and prosperous.
It was also patient. and it was willing to engage in what President Kennedy called a long twilight struggle. He could be accused of being too patient, right, or too reluctant. Or is that not fair?
Well, the Republican National Convention platform, when Eisenhower was elected in 1952, advocated for going to war with the Soviet Union to roll back their control of Eastern Europe. He certainly took a long view on that, but he also hired the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who had driven that element in the Republican platform. So that's one thing. I think he was trying to play a balance with an America that had fought two major wars in the time he was a general officer in the Army, and there wasn't an enormous enthusiasm for another one. So he was certainly playing a long game because the short game looked so unattractive. But the other thing was that Eisenhower really believed that weapons don't cause war, that political commitments are what drive warfare. And there's this famous incident during the 1958 Berlin crisis. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, issues an ultimatum that unless the United States recognized East Germany and handed over control in East Berlin to them, that the Soviet Union would cut off all access and trigger a war with the United States. Eisenhower's response to that was to have Khrushchev informed that if you want a war over Berlin, we will give it to you. So he wasn't afraid of really committing to our fundamental security obligations. He just often thought that on marginal issues, you had to play a limited resource and longer game. And one of those limited resources that Eisenhower unleashed very effectively was clandestine operations, right? To inhibit the taking of power by either outright communists or national liberation leaders in much of the decolonization movement that were going to be Soviet allies and therefore would tip the global balance of power in ways he thought invidious to America's security and prosperity.
Okay, so let's bring his way of seeing the world to the present and look at Ukraine. Russia invades Ukraine. Ukraine remarkably pushes back in a way that no one expected. The much larger power, the superpower, not all the way back to the pre-invasion border, and certainly not all the way out of Ukraine. But there was a time there when we felt like Ukraine was winning, and may have actually, in some respects, won a moral victory already. Russia had been depleted. Putin looked like a disaster. But now it's more frustrating and more difficult. The Russians are now coming back. They haven't been able to, the vaunted spring offensive from a year ago didn't really turn out that well. Where would Eisenhower's lines be on American involvement in this? What would his attitude be toward what is victory for now? What would he be advising?
Eisenhower, I believe, would, as the Biden administration has, not want American forces fighting in Ukraine. He really believed that where the United States did not have a security commitment, that American forces should not be used. Moreover, he believed American conventional forces should not be engaged in a war that we were not willing to fight to its nuclear apocalypse. Right? That was his criticism of Truman policy in the war in Korea. But what Eisenhower would do that the Biden administration hasn't done is, first of all, he would be repeatedly and adamantly making the case that for 7% of the U.S. defense budget last year, Ukraine was fighting a war that we feared NATO would have to fight. So he would be making the public case that it is in America's interest to help Ukraine win that war. He would not be as careful and fostering of concern about either escalation, the point about if you want a war over Berlin, I will give it to you, in the way that President Biden keeps wringing his hands in public about anxiety about World War III. Eisenhower would understand that you shape Russian choices by constraining their options. So if, for example, I believe when the Russians made a nuclear threat over Ukraine, I believe President Eisenhower would say, we will mobilize international opposition to you forever if you cross the nuclear threshold. We will hunt down everybody involved in the decision-making or the execution of the order, and we'll either kill them or drag them to The Hague. And if you don't capitulate and leave Ukraine, we will be fostering unrest in Moldova, in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, any place Russia believes it has influence. We will be actively undercutting it. We can shape Russian choices. We just haven't done it, and Eisenhower would have done it.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot, and with that, let's call it a day. Kori, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for giving me the privilege of running the Foreign and Defense Policy team.
Well, it wasn't just me, Kori. It was a group decision. We're all in this together. Thanks very much, everybody. See you next time.